Hi everybody, my name is Nicole Alldredge and I am here today to tell you about the 1980s. I was born in 1983. So my purpose today is to talk about that decade and give you a little more insight into the 80s. It was really an awesome time. It reminds me a lot of what's going on in today's times because there was a lot of crisis, there was a lot of technological growth, and then there was a lot of popular media and advancements in various things. So I'm going to begin by telling you about some of the historic events that were occurring during the 1980s, especially focusing on crisis and political and economic problems. One of the things that began in the 1980s was the Cold War. It actually began in the 1970s, but occurred throughout the 1980s. Mostly relations between the Soviet Union and the United States and the rest of the world were very stressed. Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister. That began in the late 70s, and President Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 as the United States president. It was the switch towards foreign policy that led to a lot of issues with the Soviet Union. There was a lot of nuclear arms racing, and a lot of tension was in the air between the countries. The essence of war was kind of lingering around, and it was a very uncertain time in our history. I was born in 1983, which was just before the Cold War ended, so it was a very stressed out time for a lot of the world. What's similar to today's times was the fact that in 1980 there was a recession that was occurring. It was started because of the global economic recession that developed mostly in the late 80s, but also in the 1980s in the early period. It was a severe recession that began in about 1981 and ended in about 1982. The primary cause of this was mostly a money policy that was established by the foreign reserve system to try to control inflation. Unfortunately, because of the wake of an oil crisis that happened in the 70s, it afflicted the economy in a negative way, which led to recession. Unfortunately, the nation's unemployment rate was very, very high. It was the highest since the Great Depression, which we're all pretty much familiar with now because we're going through a similar period in time right now. The employment rate for the nation of the United States was about 10.8, which was very, very high, especially for the 80s. A lot of things that included and influenced this was housing prices, stealing and manufacturing prices, the production of automobiles, which experienced the downturn because there was because of the recession. Many of the economic factors that supplied and aided in these industries suffered from this, and it was just kind of a circle around effect. It also led to a world debt crisis in which a lot of the Latin American countries had created a lot of debt that they couldn't pay back. So what happened was the United States had to bail out several areas, including Mexico, because they had a lot of international debt and it was spreading to the rest of the world. So a lot of this is very similar to today's times. So the 1980s was pretty close to having problems that we're experiencing still today. So this is the 40th president who reigned during most of the 1980s. This is President Ronald Reagan, and he was our president from 1981 to 1989. So moving on to some technological great advances that we had into the 1980s. This is what's very exciting because the 1980s had a boom of great technology that we are grateful for today as we know it. We wouldn't have iPhones, cell phones, or anything else without the 1980s. There was a lot of great geniuses that invented many great inventions. The number one great invention in my mind is something I'm using right now, which is the personal computer. Without the 1980s, we wouldn't have had this. So this is what our very first computer looked like. It was created by IBM. This one was created in March of that year, and it was the IBM PXT personal computer, and it featured one that had a hard drive in it. Some other noted technologies that were great that helped us advance today is the CD. So the CD is something that a lot of us were familiar with, and we even still use to burn music or transfer documents, things like that today. One of the things that some of you might not be familiar with was called the Walkman. The Walkman was basically a cassette tape player that had headphones similar to an old version of an iPod. It came out in 1982, and the actual first CD that was released was Billy Joe's 52nd Street. The Walkman was a Japanese invention and was created in 1979. However, by 1986 is where it really hit the mainstream. So also what we're responsible for in the 1980s was a video set recorder. This was new to come about in technology. TV was very popular at the time. There was a lot of shows and things that were occurring, and a lot of people worked and couldn't be at their TVs. There was no DVR as we have today. So what they invented was called the video cassette recorder. So the video cassette recorder could allow you to record your shows or sporting events and watch it at a later time. So it was a preliminary artifact to today's DVR. So one of the most awesome inventions ever was the mobile phone, which was invented and came about in the 1980s. It was invented and launched by Motorola in 1983, and it had 1 hour of talk time and used an LED display. So there you go. No more 5 to 8 hour phone conversations. All you had was a 1 hour phone conversation on it, but that sure beat walking to payphones to use, which were really annoying to use. Another invention created in the 1980s was the camcorder. This was created in 1983, and it was launched by Sony and JVC. And at last but not least, gaming consoles. We wouldn't have Xboxes, PlayStations, or any of that without the first launch of the Atari, which was in 1977. However, it did not become popular until 1980 when the popular name Space Invaders appeared. It also grew way more popular when the famous Pac-Man was released in the same year. And I guess we're pretty much all referred to and familiar with the old Pac-Man game consoles that were out there. So there you go, some awesome inventions from the 1980s. Life as we know it today couldn't exist without those inventions that were made back in that time period. So last but not least, I'm going to go over some significant cultural events and entertainment, and some other noteworthy events that did happen in the 1980s. Some of the things that were popular were some movies. This is the first popular movie, which many are familiar with still to this day. This is the poster for E.T. E.T. Phone Home. So that was in the 1980s. Still popular today. Also, a very, very popular film, Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. A lot of people are familiar with Star Wars saga still today. One was released in 2000. Also, there was Michael Jackson's Thriller. So Michael Jackson was on the scene then in 1980s, and he especially came onto the scene with his Thriller video. He was also known during that time period for inventing the moonwalk. One of the things that was especially awesome for little girls around the world, and everyone had to have, including myself, was a Cabbage Patch Kid. So you couldn't be a girl and not have your very own Cabbage Patch Kid. So they were, looking back, they were kind of creepy, and I don't know why we liked them so much, but they were very popular along with something called glowworms. So those were some of the awesome things that were going around in the 1980s. Some other noteworthy events were there was an assassination on Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Also, John Lennon of the Beatles was assassinated in 1980 in New York City. So a lot of people still go to Strawberry Fields to commemorate that. There was also an assassination attempt on the Pope. So it was a very crucial time where emotions and plots were going on. The first woman was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1980 as well. In 1981, AIDS first came onto the scene and was identified as a plague. So it began to draw public attention and get a lot of knowledge from everybody. Sally Ride became the first U.S. woman who was launched into space in 1983. In 1985, the famous movie Back to the Future opened, so a lot of people are familiar with that. 1985, there was also the We Are the World campaign that released that charity single. 1985, the wreck of the Titanic was found, so that was a super exciting thing. 1986 took a bad turn, again with the space race. The shuttle Challenger did explode. It was a horrible time. A lot of people watched that in fear and awe and disgust at, our reach for the arms race to the moon and nuclear war, space. All these things were occurring, and it was an elevated time for progress, but it was also a very sad regress when the Challenger exploded. There was also the Chernobyl nuclear disaster that occurred in 1986. And in 1986, the USSR launched their Mir space station. So again, there was a lot of heatedness to be the first people in space. Also, DNA was first used to convict criminals in 1987, so a lot of technological medical advances were starting to come onto the scene. 1989 was when the Berlin Wall fell. This was the end of the era. It was a move away from conflict between countries and a move towards peace. And in 1989, the Exxon Valdez spilled millions of gallons on the Gulf coastline. It was a horrible time. I remember this as a child. There was a lot of animals that were devastated. They were killed. The spill was huge. There was a lot of huge motivations and organizations to clean up after this horrible event. There has been other oil spills that have occurred later than this time period. However, this was the first significant horrible one. So I hope that I have covered a lot about the 80s. I wish I could talk longer, but I was trying to be succinct and go over a lot of various points. But basically, the 1980s was a very conflicted time. There was a lot of unsurety about military issues. There was a lot of technical advances trying to go on with space. There was a lot of popular things that were occurring in the music, the movies. It was a very transcending time in our history, and it reminds me quite a bit of today's times. There's a lot of frustration and insecurity, but there's also a lot of positive things that came from this time period. So I hope you learned something, and good luck in all the class, and thank you, Professor Moore, for letting us post this online.